And good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whenever you happenstance into this incredible opportunity to discuss really what's on all of our minds. And it is, as of this recording, Friday, June 14th at approximately 3 p.m. my time. And I am joined by none other than the legends, Bill Black, William K. Black, and of course, David K. Johnston. And I'll introduce Bill first momentarily. Bill is a retired professor from the University of Kansas City, recently retired professor from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, where his primary appointment was in economics, joint in law. He teaches at the University of Minnesota's Law School, where he is the distinguished scholar in residence for financial regulation. Bill has degrees in economics, law, and his doctorate is in criminology, and he was a financial regulator and a serial whistleblower. His areas of principal expertise are elite white-collar crime and corruption, finance, and regulation. And also, we are joined by David K. Johnston, one of the premier experts in all things Donald Trump, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, as well as a professor in law and a tax expert, among other things. And I guess I'll get right to the task at hand, gentlemen. Obviously, we've just had a monumental moment with all things Donald Trump, considering the fact that, Mr. Johnson, you've covered Donald from the 80s forward. But it was no small feat for the jury trial in Manhattan to render 34 felony convictions for a variety of falsification of business records, as well as, of course, defrauding the American people. And I think on that note, I would just like to get an open-ended sort of response to how you reacted to both of you when the verdict was rendered. I guess I'll start with you, David.
Well, the verdict didn't surprise me at all. The prosecution very easily proved their case. And remember, Michael Cohen, the last witness, a very smart strategic move by the prosecutors, was prosecuted by the Trump Justice Department for essentially the same set of facts and sent to federal prison for 3 years, although he didn't serve the entire time. The verdict to me was sad. I mean, I wrote a piece about how I'd waited 36 years to write a lead. Donald Trump is a felon, because I had figured out within weeks of meeting him that he was a walking criminal disaster, but had found and learned from the notorious Roy Cohn how to beat federal grand juries. He beat 4 of them, how to get regulators to look the other way or just fine him in minor ways, and get away with his lifelong criminal activities. What I'm concerned about now is that if the state judge in this case, Juan Marchand, doesn't give Trump prison time, which I think he should, because not only is Trump guilty, but he is recalcitrant. He has no contrition on his part, and there are 10 criminal contempts. But also that he immediately sends him to prison, maybe gives him 10 days to get his affairs together, that this will simply embolden Trump and encourage more people. Now, Bandy Lee was a Yale psychiatry professor whom I knew, and she began saying that Donald Trump is deeply mentally ill, and he is making people around him mentally ill. And Yale University fired her for this. So much for academic freedom. And Bandy says that what we're seeing is something she calls Trump contagion. Mental health is not just a personal issue to the person who is suffering. Mental health can be a public health issue. And we just saw yesterday all or virtually all of the Republican senators meet with Donald Trump and embrace him, including Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham, who had both said he had led an insurrection. So here's a man who, by their own accounts, tried to overthrow our government, and they are embracing him. And this is how, as Bandy very well puts it, you are seeing a public mental health crisis. And this is not unique to the United States. This has happened throughout history. It's happened around the world. It's something that gets very little attention, unfortunately. And anything short of putting Trump behind bars is simply going to cause this public mental health crisis, this epidemic, to spread. And so I hope very much that the judge not only puts him in jail, but also doesn't say until your appeals are run out or after November 5th, but says, you got a few days to get your life in order.
That's an amazing open statement, David, considering that I recall on June 6th, just a few days ago, that the New York Times had published an op-ed by none other than Mitch McConnell, warning about making the same mistakes of the 30s that, of course, led to all things what would become D-Day. So your irony is not lost on us as an opening statement. Bill.
I got to leave you for just a minute, but go ahead. I'll be right back.
Okay. I'll push pause. It's just remarkable. Bill, your thoughts?
So very much what David says, just I'll give it from my lens. This is a demonstration of how uniquely powerful and uniquely dangerous these things that we call in criminology biz control, fraud, and predation are. This seeming legitimacy, even when it is absolutely threadbare, right? As David said, and I don't want to diminish David's analytical abilities because he was among the very first in the nation to call this out, but Trump was obvious, right? And Trump almost wanted to be obvious for some of the psychological problems and daddy issues and such. And yeah, Roy Cohn was this key figure, but Trump could have been brought down by any effective prosecutors from the first month of his operations, because Trump did grift 100% of the time in all his activities, and he had no discipline about giving gifts to people that were paying attention to what he was doing. Yes, this was actually a very good prosecution in terms of preparation. You could see it in how they presented the witnesses. You could see it in how they streamlined the case. You could see it in the order of presentation. You could see it in what they were ready for in cross-examination. They neutralized in advance through the way they presented the direct. And then they were given this incredible gift of the defense calling one of the worst potential witnesses available. But they were ready to take advantage of that gift and tear him to shreds, but not just tear him to shreds, but to show how he supported the nature of the prosecution. And there's another way to count these verdicts because they have to be unanimous. So it's really 12 times the 38 counts, right? In terms of what humans need to find. That's an astonishing degree of unanimity that you just do not expect to see in any numbers-oriented, has some degree of accounting type presentation of white-collar crime. But this is the weird thing, and people don't get this. America has absolutely unmatched capacity to prosecute. There is nothing, I mean legitimate prosecutions. I don't mean show trials. They're show trials for powerful people. When the Chinese Communist Party wants to get rid of a number two who's viewed as a threat, they have a trial. It's a show trial, right? I'm talking about real trials. The United Kingdom is virtually incapable of convicting anybody from the analog to a Donald Trump, who again is sort of a C- type elite white collar criminal in these things. And it's audacity, audacity, audacity. It's not genius. that explains how these people rise. And it's a bunch of those psychological things that psychologists talk about, the dark tetrad, right? And Trump exemplifies each of those dimensions. Everybody knows he's a narcissist. Even he would, indeed, as a narcissist, he would brag about being a narcissist, probably, right? But they are also people who are psychopaths, and they are people that like sadism, right? And the fourth dimension is machiavellianism. And, that's like quintessential Trump. So when psychologists see these people, even though they've got all kinds of ethical strictures these days, they immediately go, yes, 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 that guy's a crook, right? So we're all seeing the same person, and it is the willingness to actually do the work and take out the sleaze. Think how much disaster in the world we could have avoided if a mid-level prosecutor 30 years ago had actually brought the case, right? By doing the same due diligent work and such. And Trump would have actually been even worse at that point and easier to convict.
Well, a lot of things come to mind, Bill, when you touched upon several things, particularly, Michael Cohen and Bob Costello come to mind, as you've taught us all along about Gresham's dynamic. The first thing that I thought of when I was hearing Michael Cohen's testimony, and then the, uproarious sort of reaction that they caught him in a lie and he perjured himself, given the fact that, wait a second, don't CEOs look for guys to work within the system to be able to read between the lines and do the dance that the marionette or the Machiavellian sort of approach within this sort of composite? And it was interesting because Costello comes out and look, Michael Cohen's like what they call him, the all-time greatest goat liar, right? The greatest of all-time liar. But meanwhile, it's that Donald Trump synergy, which is lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate. And the whole time, it just seemed like the prosecution was able to use that, obviously, to get this extraordinary, how many did you say, 78 plus levels to be able to get those convictions?
38 times 12.
34
sorry, 34 times 12.
34 times 12. Okay, but remarkable. But anyway, your thoughts about the Gresham's dynamic briefly, though, with Michael Cohen, if you don't mind, if you could just.
Sure. So, he's like, the D- version of Roy Cohn. He's not someone that's very effective. The sweet spot are the folks we dealt with in the savings and loan debacle. They always hired top tier audit firms. They almost always hired the best law firms in the country. And you just need one of the partners or wannabe partners that's going to bring in what are, they're called whales in both of these things, the big client. But you don't want them to be stupid, right? You don't want them to have lack self-control. You want them to be able to, we could have a videotape of the pitch they made to get the job, the dog and pony show, we call it. And we would be useless to us as prosecutors or litigators because they would do it so smoothly. And there are just some code words you'd use about, for example, financial statements are the registrant statements, not the lawyer statements or the auditor's statements. And everybody gets it, what's going on. And then they don't do stupid stuff and they don't put stuff in writing. These clowns did all kinds of stupid stuff all the time that made convictions much easier. Michael Cohen, the law school he graduated from has been voted the worst law school in America. We have 1,000 law school types. We have terrible law schools. This is the worst of the worst. And the law school glorified him, and their thing before the scandal broke of, hey, we got Donald Trump's top lawyer, is these things. So again, we're not dealing with the big leagues. The Trump Truth Social just did a revised accounting statement. It's called an S1 because their last one was based on these fraudulent accountants who've just been finally after they went, David, 0 for 21, right?
Yeah.
In the reviews.
Yep.
0 for 21. You can't even stay in single A baseball going 0 for 21, but you could be the fastest growing accounting firm in America. That's the example of the Gresham's dynamic in which bad ethics drives good ethics out of the marketplace. But they, again, were so bad that they're not good as a cover story either. So the Trump folks had to get rid of him and bring in a new folks. And this new registration has risk factors, the standard thing in these disclosures. And it goes on and it goes on and it goes on and it goes on, listing all the Trump businesses that have failed. I mean, this is the reverse Midas touch. The only things that succeeded were run by other people, right? Like the TV show. Trump had nothing to do with running the show. The rooms in which it takes place that are supposedly in Trump Tower. Trump is David can tell you this. He's terrible at architecture and other things. They had to build sets to make them look like this was somebody who has a class act. This, again, is the maybe C+, and he's a C+ solely because he inherited money. If he had just taken the money and he inherited and put it into a fund, right, like Vanguard, he really would have $20 billion these days, right? Yeah, so,
Patrick, if I may, the audience should know something here about Bill. Bill was the regulator. He was just a regulator, no big, powerful position, who figured out more than 30 years ago that a bunch of crooks had gotten their hands on some savings and loans and were looting them. And they were doing it in a pretty sophisticated way, but once you grasp what they were doing, it was clear they were crooks. They were looting the place. And as a result of Bill's work, there were more than 3,000 FBI investigations and almost close to 1,000 high-level bankers actually got prison time. And Bill, after this experience for which he was denigrated, not honored, there ought to be a statue to Bill and a few other people I've written about over the years in Washington, decided to go study criminology. And Bill devised a new theory in the field of criminology called control fraud. Now, when I was in college, back in the age of dinosaurs, we were taught that the executives in charge of a business, they were going to try and run the business for their comfort and their pleasure, and they're going to tend to want to have lavish expense accounts and a nicer private jet and things like that to fly around in. But fundamentally, they're trying to make the enterprise grow. In a control fraud, they're trying to ruin the business and pull as much money out of it as they can before it collapses. And the trick is you got to keep the business going just long enough that you can say, the market turned on us, or some interest rate changed. It wasn't our fault. And you're never going to get all the money you could steal. But, one of the biggest thieves of that era told Congress, well, I only cashed in 15% of my options. Yeah, he netted $700 million in round numbers for his 15% of his options. So it's not like he walked away impoverished. And Bill's work, unfortunately, is anathema to corporate America. And you'll rarely see it mentioned in the mainstream news. And the reason for that is essential to why Donald Trump, and I agree with everything Bill said about Donald Trump and what a terrible, even crook he is. Mainstream news is almost entirely a highly accurate account of what official sources said or did with the official criticisms of it. So if the New York Times or the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle tells you the president or the governor or the mayor said this yesterday, you can be assured that's exactly what they said. But, and they will quote what the other party or someone disagreeing with that official says. But that may completely miss what's going on. And to do that, requires journalists who understand the law, fair number of those, but not as many as I'd like, who have the internal capacity to act on their own authority rather than just receiving and analyzing and putting out information. That's now into a much smaller group. They have to have editors and producers who will back them up. And they have to have this broader level of knowledge about how the system works. I read stories in the Wall Street Journal, in the New York Times, where I worked for many years, all the time, where I go, boy, that's a really readable story. Interesting read. And I also know the reporter doesn't know what they're writing about. They've put together a very readable account, but their understanding is superficial. And this is one of the core problems in journalism. So along comes a guy like Donald Trump, who figures out early on from Roy Cohn, here's how to beat law enforcement. If law enforcement comes after you, whether it's regulators or the FBI, they're corrupt, they're dishonest, they have a foul motive. You are as pure as the driven snow and never give an inch. You don't give a comma to the other side. You cannot ever do that, no matter how obvious it is. You did nothing wrong. Then he learns, oh, most journalists just accurately quote what you say, and they may need to have second verification. So he invents a character named John Barron, who is him. And he has John Barron call news organizations. In some cases, he waits at the wire services till a shift change. So the person he calls doesn't know the voice from the previous phone call to verify things. And there are news accounts, including in the New York Times, quoting John Barron, because his voice wasn't as well known back then. He couldn't get away with that today. And then he turns to threats. Donald has threatened to sue me. I can't begin to remember how many times over the last 36 years. And I always say to Donald the same thing in a very calm, calibrated voice. Donald, if you think you have a case, you should bring it. Which, of course, drives him crazy, particularly because he knows I don't say or write anything about him I can't absolutely prove. And there's a lot of things I know about him that I'm not going to say or put in print because I can't prove them. But even the things I can prove are devastating to him. Lots of reporters, what, somebody's going to sue me? I don't know what to do. And I'm talking about including a lot of seasoned veteran reporters, or they have publishers who don't want to be sued. I mean, I was literally once told by the general counsel at the Los Angeles Times, which was the richest newspaper in America. Reporters flew first class. We stayed in the fanciest hotels. I had years when my expense account was bigger than my salary, which was a good salary. I had a story killed once by the general counsel. And I said, everything in this is true. He said, well, yes, but it's very expensive to defend on the basis of truth, and we can't run the risk. And I said, all right, what's the algebra? You know, in other words, what's so many odds? What are the odds of being sued? And he said, well, we can't take 1 in 10,000. And I looked at him and I said, you run a 1 in 10,000 risk of litigation every single day in the newspaper. That's ridiculous. But you know, he had control of this, and he killed it. It's one of the reasons I stopped working there. Donald understood that threats, that claiming he was misquoted, that trying to set up reporters like me and like some others, he did successfully in some other cases, I outsmarted him so that he could claim they were blackmailing him, would work. And a lot of people who think, oh yeah, well, a reporter blackmail somebody. Sure, I'm sure reporters are as corrupt as everybody else. It's just a reality that some people believe that stuff. And so he masterfully dealt with law enforcement and the conventions of journalism. And in all of this, he's a low-grade crook. I mean, I've exposed lots of con artists over my career. There are a lot of people who've gone to jail over my stories or had their careers ended. Donald was not in the top tier of these people. He's not very smart. He's a terrible negotiator. And yet he's had this enormous success, and Bill put his finger right on it. It's audacity. You say something so audacious, you know, that we should all go, but he just gets you to not do that, and now he's home free.
Wow, because look, Bill, I have to pick up on what we both know, because David, when I was setting out to try to understand the 2008 great financial crisis, the only voice I heard at the time that made absolute sense to me was Bill Black, who I just happened to discover on a Sunday morning program that he was being interviewed by Bill Moyers, and I was like, wait a second, what else does he know? And because of that path, and I want to give this question to you, David, first, and then circle back to Bill from it, because look, what we have seen, whether it's the Fani Willis RICO case because of the fake elector scheme involving Kenneth Chesebro's architecture and Giuliani's RICO of fake documentation, or all things related to Donald Trump and the civil fraud trial, which it was, again, falsification of business records and, hyper appraising the assets, while even though the taxes weren't a part of it in terms of that particular case with Letitia James. But I kept asking myself, with the media particularly, is they didn't understand what the banks were doing. They had no idea why Deutsche Bank would be making these types of loans to Donald Trump in the first place, let alone the due diligence. But that's one side of the equation. But what we see in the patterns over and over and over in all of these cases that we continue to see with Donald Trump is defrauding the public, defrauding the United States one way or the other. Particularly what we're not going to see, of course, because of Judge Eileen Cannon and the special prosecutor's case regarding the insurrection, not to mention the Supreme Court. But we continue to see defrauding the citizens of the United States using deceptive acts and practices based on falsification of business records. I mean, that's the one through line. And as we got through this incredible trial, again, I, as a layman, did not expect to hear 34 guilty counts in a row. It was like guilty, guilty, guilty. And I know I wasn't the only one that was like you said, my God, how long have we been waiting to hear this? So given the kind of scope of what I've just laid out, again, by the media not fully understanding the motive, the control fraud, the Gresham's dynamic, all of the elements involved that are what Donald Trump's business empire and politics is, how can we, without your expertise, glean from mainstream media something that they don't understand?
Well, you've hit upon what is a really serious problem for us. And let me just deal with the lawsuit so I get it out of my head. The 418 individual votes by the jurors to convict Trump, they were either going to convict on 31 cases or all 34. There were 3 cases where the checks weren't signed by Trump. They were automated payments. So I always thought it was possible, but not likely they'd let him go on those. But it didn't make a lot of sense to do that. All 34 was a clear indication that, this man committed crimes. Donald has committed many, many, many crimes in his career. It's been his entire life. He is the 3rd generation head of a 4-generation white-collar crime family. His grandfather, when he turned 16 in 1885, and his name was Drumpf back then, like many other young men, fled Bismarck's Germany, because if you got drafted into Bismarck's army, you might spend your whole life there. It wasn't like the US where you're in and out in 2 years. He comes to America. He follows Horace Greeley's advice, go west, young man. He goes to Seattle, and he opens a restaurant that happens to have a curtain behind which are what were known in the day as sporting ladies. He then sets up the same bordello operation in Everett, Washington, because there was an expectation the Rockefellers were going to open a huge mining operation, which never happened. And then he goes to the Yukon, where he builds a hotel on land he doesn't own for sporting ladies, is getting very rich. Most pimps do get very rich. And then the Royal Canadian Mounted Police show up, whereupon he takes his money and leaves. His son, Fred, Trump's father, was a very industrious, very ambitious, and very ruthless man. And when he was a teenager, in a company owned by his mother called E. Christ and Son, he built garages for these newfangled automobiles. I mean, what does it take to build a garage? You don't have to have plumbing and electricity and all that and insulation. So you throw up a wooden building. He opened what may be the first supermarket where you get your own groceries off the shelf instead of going to the clerk, and the clerk gets them off the shelf. And he sold it for a small fortune during the Great Depression. And then in the 1950s, he was using government money to build housing for soldiers and sailors coming back from World War II. And auditors found out he had ripped the taxpayers off because he had a controlled profit, a limited profit, common in government work. He sold in today's money $40 million. and he's called before the Senate Banking and Currency Committee. Well, he doesn't show up when he's supposed to in the morning. And when he arrives in the afternoon, this is the kind of audaciousness Donald learned from. He goes, gentlemen, I didn't steal $4 million in the money of that day. That's not what happened. The money is sitting in my bank account. Well, where the hell else would you keep millions of dollars? And they didn't know what to ask on the Senate panel, and it just, the question stopped. This was years ago. I covered an LAPD investigation, and one of the assistant police chiefs said, well, if we told you how much money we're spending on our political spying operation, if somebody ended up dead, you'd all be suspects as council members. I mean, that's ridiculous. There's no connection between knowing the size of the budget and somebody getting killed. But all the questions stopped. It just stopped because they hadn't thought through where to go. So along comes Donald, who's been lying, cheating, and stealing his entire life and bragging about it. The art of the deal is one fraudulent act after another that he brags about. None of the reviews said that at the time. A few of them were skeptical, but it was more that he's a blowhard. I read the book and went, oh, this is a manual on my boasting about my cheating people. And yet he got a Casino Control Commission license. He cheated players, didn't cost him his license, only time that's ever known to have happened in Atlantic City. He plied 12, 13, and 14-year-old children with liquor and limousines and hotel rooms because they had money to gamble. You had to be 21. So we're not talking about dolled up 18-year-olds who pass. 12-year-olds? Nobody mistakes a 12-year-old. Think about it in terms of a rape case. Nobody's going to let you get off by you're saying, well, I thought she was 18 when she's 12. And yet he gets away with all of this by being incredibly audacious. And one of the other things that's benefited him is typically Trump says something that's crazy, a lie, untrue, any one of those categories. And journalists will quote him, and then they will quote people picking it apart. That's not the way you do that. Because right now, think of a song you really like, and I'm sorry, it's going to start playing in your head, and I apologize. Now, can you cite to me any line ever written by any music critic? We don't remember the critics, we remember the songs. So the way to do it when Donald tells something outrageous, untrue, lying, is you say, we're going to quote Donald Trump, but what he says is nonsense. Then you quote him, and then you start taking the nonsense apart because you've changed the lens, the mental lens through which people are looking at what he says. You also notice, by the way, Donald doesn't take questions from reporters unless they're going to be obsequious. They're going to be from Fox or Newsmax or Dr. Phil. He's last time Donald and I spoke was in 2016. And when I hung up the phone, I said, that'll be the last time he'll ever talk to me because he knew he didn't have to respond to somebody like me anymore. And you won't ever see him answering any tough questions. So it is critical that law enforcement go after him. And there are so many crimes. I'll give you a simple example. I wrote a big piece for the Sunday New York Daily News because the New York Times, my former paper, wasn't interested, saying there's as close to a slam dunk felony conviction as has ever existed in America. Donald Trump created about 6 fictitious businesses on his tax forms called Schedule Cs. It's what freelancers and independent sole proprietors file. These businesses don't exist, or in the few cases where they do exist, the revenue and the expenses match to the penny. I mean, that just never happens. Who has a multi-million-dollar enterprise and that matches to the penny? Doesn't happen. But a number of them had no revenue and big losses, or losses way in excess of their revenue. He did this 60 times. Now, here's what makes it a slam dunk case. In 1984, Donald Trump, in his tax returns, and your New York State and your federal tax returns are virtually identical, in which he submitted a business, a consulting business, no revenue, no receipts, no travel records, no invoices, nothing. But he took over $600,000 of expenses. And he insisted he was entitled to this. So there were 2 civil fraud tax trials, civil fraud, not criminal fraud. And judges in both cases not only excoriated him, but one of the judges put Trump's long-time 20-year accountant and tax lawyer, Jack Mitnick, under oath. And he gave him the tax return that was submitted to the state of New York. It didn't have a wet signature. That's when you sign with an ink pen. It had a photocopied signature. And he said to the tax lawyer who was on the prepare line, "Is that your signature?" And the guy said, "Well, that is my signature, but I neither signed that return nor prepared that return. It was done with a photocopy machine."
What year was this?
New York State. This
So
is
when?
forgery. 1984 return, the trial was in 1992.
Oh
Now,
my goodness.
nobody knew about this until 2016, when I found these cases. Could I get the New York Times interested in this? That's too old. Who cares? So I published it at the Daily Beast. Almost nobody knows about it. But here's the important part. Both the judges said to him, "Mr. Trump, you cannot create a fictitious business and take tax deductions." That he did so more than 60 times in the tax returns the Democrats made public when Trump left office, that tells you proving criminal intent, what we call mens rea in the law, is a slam. I mean, Bill may disagree with me, but I think proving criminal intent on that set of facts is a slam dunk. And I wrote a piece saying, "Alvin Bragg, you should bring this case." He should still bring this case. Trump has been just lying and cheating on documents for forever, but nobody's going after him for it. And when somebody says to me, "Well, they're piling on with all these cases," it's like, actually, they're not piling on. They could bring hundreds of cases. He's committed crime after crime after crime, many of which are still within the statute of limitations because they're ongoing conspiracies.
Wow. A couple of things just real quick to tee you up, Bill. First, as you were deconstructing that, I kept thinking about all the times I've seen recently of Donald Trump shaking hands with cops all over the country on the campaign trail, and what that means to my head, considering how there should be justice, but we have police who have no idea what's going on, or even if they do, obviously don't care, and are supporting Trump after he's been convicted of 34 felonies to start, let alone everything you've talked about that spans the course of 4 decades, and probably longer. But Bill, kind of going back to what we started though, which is what led me to you. I mean, given the pattern of deceptive acts and practices, including, fraudulent signatures and everything else that go as far as stealing the election. I mean, again, looking at what's not going to happen given Judge Eileen Cannon and so on and so forth, can you just kind of give us an overview from where you are, what maybe should happen and what is happening and what they're missing, I guess?
I'm going to give you binoculars, right? David just gave you a telescope, and I'm going to be, slightly offset, but you're going to see the same image because that's how elite white collar crime operates. And don't put too much of an emphasis on the word elite, right? Donald Trump is a proof of, you're kind of elite, not in many ways. Okay, so first, also want to mention, David talked about their jet planes. David is a personal expert in that, having taken away the jet plane of Jack Welch through stories as well of other abuses. Okay. Pecora Commission. Why was the Pecora Commission so successful in response to the Great Depression compared to any of the hearings that had to do with the Great Financial Crisis? Because Pecora wasn't a legislator. He was a judge, and he was a judge that dealt with a mob, and the mob is what this is. They just don't have names ending in vowels, and they don't, generally speaking, actually go out and kill people, right? Although they do sometimes. So he was really good. Pecora, did all the questioning. You've seen hearings where you get your 5 minutes and then there's another 5 minutes, another 5 minutes. You can't do any effective, well, it's really hard to do effective questioning in that setting. And against a well-coached witness with help, friends on one side of the aisle, they can render even good questioning pretty damn ineffective. So yes, that's what you've got to do. You have to have sustained questioning by people that understand fraud. And they don't get nonplussed, as David said, of, well, what are you saying? I didn't steal anything. It's in my bank account. I would have loved that answer, of course. Second thing, I saw the other side of it. I spent, I think, at least 3,000 hours with journalists in the savings and loan debacle, explaining the frauds, explaining the complaints, trying to put the complaints in plainer English, trying to make the complaints have juicy parts that would get picked up in stories and such. We knew the only way we could succeed is changing the mindset, which everybody knew the savings loan debacle had nothing to do with fraud. It was just inflation and such. And going, no, in fact, the antecedents were in the Texas Rent-A-Bank scandal of the 1970s. It's a bunch of the same guys and doing a more sophisticated version of the looting. But also, apropos what David is talking about, I spent then thousands of hours with our examiners saying, here's what are the indicia of fraud. You see this, it may sound innocuous, bad underwriting, but if it systemically and systematically violates the written underwriting standards and is nonsensical for honest lending, then it probably optimizes looting. And this is how we make the case. And not just the analytics, but the letters that we would write and the discussions that the examiners would have in the field, where we would put the CEO on notice and get him to agree to fix it or claim he didn't know anything about it. And then you would get violations of that, right? And intentionally lying to a federal official with a desire to screw up our process is a felony. So hundreds and hundreds of those convictions were because our examiners asked the right questions and documented them and took seriously that if you lie to me, it's a felony, it's a criminal referral. We're going to push with Justice Department. Again, you don't just make a referral. You fight for your cases. You put it in plain English in criminal referrals. You make the criminal referrals incredibly user-friendly as to how to find the key documents, how you write it up so that it's clear. And then you get continuous feedback from the top folks in each of the districts you're dealing with, because they're different. There's no national prosecution in the United States. The U.S. attorney's offices are fiefdoms. So you learn what they need and how to convince them. And that takes years. This was a 7, 8, 9-year process of getting these, as David said, about 1,000 of the top folks within the industry, but then another 700 of their top confederates in typically real estate mogul types as well. All right. So yes, it's all the things David was just explaining to you. There's the other side to it of how we effectively prosecute that mirrors in many ways, or as I say, it's sort of like a binocular. We're seeing the same thing, but we can see it more clearly when we put together these two sides of it, and we can have a bigger field of view, which if you ever try to use binoculars is a really important thing, right? Because if you hyper focus on a particular fact, that's good, and you may have a successful criminal referral on it, but you may be missing how it fits into a much broader fraud scheme as well. And so it also gets easier once you bring these successful prosecutions, and again, we're bringing them against elites who have the top lawyers in the world, the top criminal defense lawyers in the world. Trump only occasionally has barely competent lawyers. There's some that are quite good, but even those, he hadn't tried a case in 8 years, right? And it's not just having experience; it's being honed and ready for that function. So you're able to get huge advantages once you get successful prosecutions, because then the lawyers have the heart-to-heart and say, we can go to trial, but these folks are actually very competent. And there's a more than 90% likelihood that you'll lose. And if you lose and you force them to a jury trial, your sentence is likely to be significantly longer, which is the truth of how this system works. And so people begin to do pleas, and you do rifle shot prosecutions, we call them, right? We had 70 felonies we could name and prove, but we wouldn't bring 70 felonies because we couldn't bring, a third as many of the cases. In fact, a fifth of the number of cases that we'd be able to do. So we would often take the biggest ones and run with those. And of all the people we got felony convictions, and all the people were 1,700 in the case of the savings and loan industry, but something like 2,800 out of the banks in the same era. People forget this. Now, I don't know, obviously, each of these people, and nor do I know everything about the great financial crisis, but I do not know a single person who we got a felony conviction of in the savings and loan or contemporaneous banking debacles of the 80s who reappears in the great financial crisis. And that's a hell of a statement. Now, somebody can prove me wrong out of that, but it's going to be some tiny exception, even if I'm wrong.
We've covered, the core question for the public, in my opinion, being the actual journalists not understanding the crimes that they're looking at earlier in this dialogue. We've had a layout of how both of you had approached different scenarios in elite white collar fraud, but particularly David as it relates to Donald. But I don't know if any of you could have anticipated a year ago when Jack Smith started the investigation after, Merrick Garland was criticized for potentially dragging his feet to get the special counsel out of the starting blocks, that here we are in 2024, I think 140 days or so, maybe less, to the election. And we just got one criminal trial while the rest are in disarray, vis-a-vis, not to mention everything that we've seen transpire with the Supreme Court. David, can you kind of give me a state of the state based on what's at stake? And I want to insert this real quick. I listened recently, and I remember I knew who you were long before Rachel Maddow went to you regarding Donald Trump's taxes. But I remember that
I went to her.
You went to her, but that was a big moment in her career. But recently she did this really interesting and I would say very important podcast called Ultra that reveals what I thought I understood, during the America First time period of, the stuff that was influential to Nazi Germany vis-a-vis Jim Crow that would lead to the Nuremberg laws. And I always knew that we had a white supremacist state in the United States vis-a-vis slavery and yada, yada, yada. But I didn't realize how integral the actual Nazis were with the players that would ultimately be in Congress and so on and so forth. And so, for example, she took the big view and got the big picture to give us this understanding that, wait a second, MAGA is literally America First in 2024. It's a continuation. This is what they're doing. This is how they've done it. This is how they've infiltrated our system. We're perilously close and disastrously close to fascism. But meanwhile, and she does make the prescient point that the law did not have a remedy for America First at that time period. And so now we're looking down the barrel of Donald Trump with all of these different cases that aren't going to make it to trial in context to what the Supreme Court has revealed vis-a-vis Alito and Clarence Thomas and the rest, and not to mention what's going on today. Can you give us, from your wide lens, how you're parsing this at the moment, given all of the things that are in the air?
Well, Donald Trump will lose the popular vote, and he'll lose by a minimum of 10 million votes and perhaps much more. That doesn't mean he will not get back to the White House. There are only 7 states that can go either way. And the Democrats, who have a long history of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, appear to be making the same mistake they make every 4 years. Instead of putting most of their money into a ground game in those 7 states, get people registered, get them to the polls, even if you have to drive them to the polls, and have tons of lawyers on election day to help when people are denied casting ballots. They're spending money on TV ads because the consultants get paid a kickback on the TV ads. You place the ads and you get, I think, current average rates around 13%. So you place $100 million for the ads, you made $13 million minus your costs. You're doing very nicely. And that's what matters. The Democrats have some things going for them. First of all, most people aren't crazy. They aren't enemies of liberty and freedom. They don't want a dictator, and they've got Dobbs. And the Republicans, since the Dobbs decision, that's the one that undid Roe v. Wade, every election where Dobbs or Roe has been on the ballot, directly or indirectly, the results have been overwhelmingly bad for the Republicans. Lots of Republican women have turned out to make sure that, even if they're my age and they don't have to worry about abortion, their granddaughters can get an abortion if they need one. Now the Republicans are proposing to criminalize contraception. I don't think that's a winning strategy with most young people. But if they don't know about it or they don't believe it, then they're not going to be motivated to vote. So the issue, elections are decided by who turns out to vote and then who they vote for. That should be the focus. But on another level, we need to fundamentally be changing the way we teach history, the way we educate young people. I teach right now pre-law students at Syracuse. These are people who want to be lawyers, and I'm getting them ready to go to law school with a broad, here are the principles and theory of law. Many of them arrive without a real understanding of just the textbook version that you and I and Bill got in junior high school. Of here's how an idea becomes a bill, becomes a law. Some of them in their papers just assume the president just issues a law, a decree. It's just astonishing that this collapse. And I have talked to many, many other professors across the country, and I don't remember anybody who said, "No, that's wrong. My students aren't like that," including at some of the really elite schools. So there's been a fundamental breakdown in our education system. We don't teach students, for example, that, in the South, some places still teach the War of Northern Aggression. And you hear this nonsense, the Civil War wasn't about slavery. Just go to the internet and put in Mississippi secession or Arizona territory secession or Alabama secession. And the very first line is, we must defend the institution of slavery. But we don't teach that. And because of the severe decline in religious connection, young people are also not getting a fundamental moral education. Why do we believe and feel what we do? What's the basis of your philosophy about life? And I say this, I'm a stone cold atheist, okay? But I've been a paid consultant to almost all the mainstream large Protestant denominations and interdenominational groups on issues of moral behavior. And if you don't have some deep understanding of what our constitutional system is about, why it came about the way it did, what its flaws are, because it's an 18th century document, and about the underpinning moral issues, integrity, honor, prudence, because Donald is the anti-prudence person, then you don't have any moorings from which to operate, and you're subject to a lot of manipulation. That we need to really worry about and focus on, so that we have a society of people who are free, want to be free, and most importantly, understand what it takes to have the liberties of the people endure.
And going back to your first point, accountability, which Donald Trump, I see David Axelrod out there saying, no, he's a former president. Donald Trump should never have been president, considering everything that we've talked about. And I don't think he should have the respect that goes with that.
There's no reason not to hold him accountable. I mean, right. As Mitch McConnell said on January 7th of 2021, I think it was then, it may have been a few days later, he said, we shouldn't impeach Donald Trump the second time. He's no longer in office. So I guess it was a little later than that. The courts should hold him accountable. Well, we just saw the courts hold him accountable. And now it's, oh, no, we can't do that. We have the Supreme Court to free him, et cetera. We have a system. Respect the system.
The Supreme Court justice is flying an upside down flag in collaboration with the insurrection and ruling on the insurrection. So Bill, lastly, when David talked about the documentation fabrication that was involved with that case as far back as 1986-ish, I think is
84.
84. It's extraordinary for me to think of the millions and millions of pieces of documentation fabrication that were used in liars' loans, that worked themselves through the system, that would ultimately be integral to what I would call liars' foreclosures. It became a modem of business techniques, honestly, that nobody has ever stopped. When you're looking at the patterns of Donald Trump, given everything that can you give us some closing comments, Bill, on what are we looking at here, and what isn't happening? And the last question, it seems like, within the context of this, to David's point, if you do not have accountability, they just get more and more and more empowered. I have seen nothing but just disregard for these convictions all over social media. There's an actual campaign that's like, I'm going to vote for the outlaw, as if Donald Trump is somebody to think of in Wild West, iconic, and it just in the way that we do within film and so forth. But anyway, look, Bill, it's really hard to see the law fails, is what I'm trying to say.
All right. So let me pick up deceit. Deceit is the common link between fraud and predation. Deceit is about lying strategically. And when people begin to lie strategically en masse, and you can't be a Republican, elected Republican, and not agree to be part of this land of deceit. But nothing works, as David says, if you lie about everything important. Personal relationships can't work if a couple is lying to each other. Society can't work. You can't have compromises in classic legislative compromises to get things done. You can't have honest reporting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when you allow lies and indeed champion them, as you say, then it's all going to fall apart. That is related to accountability. If you can lie, what's to be accountable for, right? So in the savings and loan debacle, 5 U.S. senators, the Speaker of the House, an incredibly powerful Speaker of the House, the head of our agency, the other presidential appointee to our agency. Who did all of these people choose to ally themselves with? The regulators trying to stop the fraudsters? No. They intervened to try to prevent us from prosecuting these folks. That's explicitly what they feared the most, is the prosecution of these elite criminals, because, as I said at the time, always, the highest return on assets is always a political contribution. Nowadays, of course, it's a political contribution that gets you a Supreme Court justice so that you can make a personal donation to the Supreme Court and influence the Supreme Court to your ways, if you're very wealthy. But again, a pattern of lies, of preventing disclosure of those facts, right? So people will, absent accountability, absent transparency, like the media is supposed to generate, they will find it in their interest to, if the person in power is bad enough, then you get a political Gresham's dynamic in which bad ethics drives good ethics out of the polity, out of the entire leadership of the Republican Party. I mean, you could count on one hand the number of senior elected Republican officials in office willing to speak out against Trump. Maybe you could do it with 2 fingers, type of thing. That is the level we've fallen. And to pick up David, what, I too, I'm not a particularly religious type, but I'm hugely affected by the whole concept of the Society of Friends, the concept that you have an ethical duty to speak truth to power, right? That's how I was raised. And maybe the religious part didn't stick so much, but that ethical part, that's what it means to be an adult. That is your responsibility. Doesn't have to be comfortable. Can bankrupt you, type of thing. So that was really important. And the other for me is tikkun olam. We try to bind up the ills of the world to the extent we can. We try to make the world a somewhat better place in our personal dealings and in our policies. So yeah, I don't see, when I teach students, that they have a grounding. I just don't hear them speaking out of ethical principles and, saying, this is my ethical principle and therefore this is my view on how I should proceed and how I should urge the nation to proceed. So I very much, like David, want those things to return. And we're getting the opposite now.
Well, and the one thing I thought that goes hand in hand with what you were talking about, particularly in your career, but also by way of corruption being the lowest return on investment with a corrupt politician, is media has been bought in several sectors. We've seen what Fox has done, and we now know what X is doing. I can pick out on an hourly basis probably thousands, if not millions, if I had the actual resources to do it, of lies and defamation and massive, massive propaganda that's going into. Go ahead.
Right, but this is about to get much, much, much worse. All right. So one of the leading things they want to overturn is New York Times versus Sullivan. Right. And it's precisely to be able to intimidate whistleblowers and journalists. Right. They are going to go after this is in the Heritage Plan. They are going to go after the inspector generals, who were the only internal institutionalized restraint in the last Trump administration. And by the way, the Clinton-Gore administration is the folks that began the war on inspector generals.
Yeah. Right.
Right. So they're going after that. And I think they're going to go after the anti-SLAPP suit legislation in a number of places as well. The SLAPP suit restrictions have been very useful against these Trump liars, right? People have been able to get rid of the baseless libel suits and get, attorney's fees.
Wow. Well,
I think all 3 of those will be under, well, they're already under attack. I think they'll be under systematic effort at destruction if Trump wins.
Whether or not Trump wins, is it still in jeopardy?
No. Well, the Supreme Court is definitely got several members that want to go repeal New York Times versus Sullivan. And a number of states deliberately don't have SLAPP legislation.
So it's literally all on the line. And to David's point, though, and I will say this in closing, was, what I was so inspired by the jury verdict in New York was that when everything was presented the way it was done, effectively, professionally, the way it should have been done with effective prosecutors, all things considered, the verdict by the American people, above all of the perception of media, all of the perception of the political parties, and all of the other dynamics that are at play, they ruled guilty, 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 guilty. Go ahead, Bill.
And to pick up David, of how Democrats constantly commit malpractice, you know what millions, tens of millions of Americans share? We've been jurors. I've been a juror. You want to be insulted that jurors are just corrupt, lying SOBs and such? Stupid move, but only if the Democrats make it a stupid move. So maybe it won't be a stupid move.
Yeah. Any final thoughts, David, gentlemen? Are you guys okay? Until next time, thank you so much, David K. Johnston, William K. Black. My name is Patrick Lovell. Onwards and upwards.
Thank you.
Thank you.
June's birthday.